thank you so much for having me talk today. I've heard such great things about everyone in here. Not specifically. Marcus just, associates himself with awesome people.
That's right.
So this is monitoring the 5-minute version. The idea is that I mostly want to do Q&A. I love answering questions, and it's hard to anticipate different questions that come up. So rather than try to, I figured let's just go with the nice quick overview just to spark some discussion, and then we'll go from there. So Great. This is monitoring the 5-minute version. So who am I? I run a monitoring consulting company called Aster Labs. As Marcus mentioned, I'm working on a book called Practical Monitoring from O'Reilly. It's done, just waiting on it to ship. I also run Monitoring Weekly, an email newsletter. And I used to be a DevOps engineer / site reliability engineer / system administrator, whatever the hot new term of the day is for that. So what is monitoring? This is the definition I like, mostly because there's no real great definition of monitoring. This was coined by my friend Greg. So monitoring is the action of observing and checking the behavior and outputs of a system and its components over time, which sounds nice and complex, but really what that means is whatever you do to make sure your app is working as you think it should, that's monitoring. It really isn't that complicated. So for something like say you have a WordPress site, it hosts your own blog, not a lot of traffic. Maybe you just monitor with Pingdom, or like a cron job that hits it every 10 minutes and sends you an email. That's monitoring. On the far extreme end, you have companies like Twitter who have entire teams that build completely brand new tools to monitor down to the minutia of how Twitter functions. That's also monitoring. So it can get complex, but to start with, it doesn't really need to be. So one of the questions I always get is, why should you care? There's a lot of companies out there that they don't invest in monitoring. And it's not because they're bad. It's just they don't really get why it's something they should care about. So most people think, well, the early detection of problems, that's good. Like, I like knowing when my stuff is about to go on fire. That leads to better reliability if I'm able to catch these earlier. But better reliability actually leads to increased user retention and your company reputation. The worst thing that I've found is when you know about when your customers know about problems before you do, especially when you find out about problems from your customers on Twitter. Like, that's awful. It used to be years ago when Twitter was running their old Rails stack, they had the fail well. And just the reputation for reliability was awful. It was absolutely atrocious. And thankfully, they didn't make any money, so no one really cared that much. But if your company actually does revenue and your app is unreliable, then you're going to lose users. When you're running SaaS companies, your primary driver of revenue is not user acquisition, it's user retention. The more users you lose, the worse your company is going to be. But company reputation, especially when you're competing against other companies, just as important. So all that leads to more money for everyone. So monitoring does actually lead directly to more revenue. So monitoring, I mentioned, doesn't have to be complicated. It isn't complicated, but it can be complex. So I have this idea of observation points. There are several different places that you can perform monitoring. A lot of you as managers and agency owners probably understand monitoring at like Google Analytics and Mixpanel and other marketing metrics tools. That's all monitoring. But then going further down, you have tools like New Relic and App Dynamics to monitor at the application level. And then monitoring for front end and browser, and then it goes on down to server, network, and security. So there's a lot of different places that you can perform monitoring, and it's all different observation points. And all these are equally important. If you have to start somewhere, start at the top. Using something like Pingdom to monitor is my site functioning from the outside world. That's the best place to start, and then get more complex from there. So the three biggest mistakes that I've seen: not doing it. If you're not monitoring, you're losing out or not taking it seriously. Blaming your tools. I've seen a lot of people will say, well, my monitoring sucks because this tool sucks. Well, that may be true. There are ways to improve your monitoring without changing your tools. A craftsman doesn't blame their tools. Your tools may not be optimal, but they're still very much capable. So how I've seen this manifest is companies will pick a tool and they'll use it for 3 to 6 months and say, oh, wow, you know what, this really isn't working for us. Our monitoring isn't getting any better. And they'll switch tools and repeat the cycle. Instead, what you should do is take a step back and say, well, why isn't this working? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And why isn't this tool allowing us to do that? It's often not really the tool's problem. The last one is one that makes a lot of sense. So I call this an anti-pattern in the book, in that monitoring is not someone's job. I mentioned earlier that companies like Twitter have teams that build monitoring, but what they do is actually build tools to do monitoring. They don't run the tools. They don't configure things. They provide a service internally to the rest of the company. What I've seen here is when you say to someone, your job is to now set up monitoring. So anytime the application changes or a new server is added or anything like that, they go to this person and say, hey, add this server to monitoring. And that sounds fine and all. The problem is that person has no idea about how the application functions. So that makes them in the worst position possible to build monitoring, because they don't know what it looks like. They don't know what good looks like. They don't know what bad looks like. Instead, you should have the entire team be responsible for monitoring, not just a person. So that is the super quick overview of monitoring. I know that a lot of you want to talk about SLAs, so we have a special section on this. SLAs are fun. So what is an SLA? A service level agreement is basically a promise or guarantee between you and your customers, or in some cases you and another internal team, that I'm going to perform to X level or else. Sometimes the or else is optional.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
Hey, can we pause before we go into SLA and see if we have any questions
Absolutely.
about monitoring? I know I have a couple.
Okay.
And it looks like we had a few people join while we were chatting. And so I'm just going to throw it out there. Like, I thought it was really interesting. Can you back up a slide maybe or two?
Yeah.
There you go. The three biggest.
Oh.
Got all these slides.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
There.
That one, I was curious. Whenever I've thought about monitoring, I'll just go first with my question. My biggest problem is I don't know what good looks like.
Yeah.
And I get the whole idea where it's like, oh, it's either down, because Pingdom or Uptime Robot will tell me, oh, it's down or it's up. I know that up is better than down. But when we come to any sort of other metric or level of sophistication, right, what is good and what is bad? And how can we start thinking about, because monitoring gives us data, right? Yeah. And besides just the idea that the site's up or down, which seems very binary, how can we start to make decisions about what's good or bad, expected or unexpected? That's just my first question here.
Sure. So I really like that question. I will actually go back to here because this helps me answer that question of the reason that I say to start monitoring at the business level is if you start monitoring at like the networker servers of, well, my CPU is load of 5 over the last 10 minutes, and now it's a load of 10. Like, is that good or bad? Well, I don't know, and I don't actually care. Like, it's kind of a pointless metric in that it doesn't tell me what I actually want to know, which is, can my users use my site? Are they paying me money? Is everything working? Are my users happy? So instead, I say start at the business level. And as you mentioned, using something like Pingdom or Uptime Robot to say, is the site up or down is great. It's a good start. But you should actually go further in of, let's say you run a SaaS app. your SaaS app has a certain number of transactions that are occurring on a regular basis. So what I want to know is things like, are users logging in? Okay, that's helpful to know, but how often? How many users are logging in per minute? So I care about that rate, but I also want to know how many users are, when they log in, are getting a failure screen. And then watching that over time as well, or things like my revenue, my transactions. So if my app allows someone to purchase something, then I want to be tracking that so that I can say, well, I have 10 transactions per minute on a pretty regular basis, and it fluctuates between 10 and 12. But, over the last hour, it's gone down to 3.
Something's probably wrong.
Right. It's like, I don't know that something's broken. Like, that could just be the time of day. It could just be total coincidence, but it's something I should probably check into because it looks abnormal. Once you get further down into the application, you can start instrumenting the application itself to check on things like login success versus failures, transaction success versus failures, and track these as metrics and rates. And the more you dig into your application of really understanding what your application does, then you end up with all these numbers that you know exactly what they mean. You may not know what good looks like, not yet, but you know what the metric means. And then from there, once you have, say, a few days of data, you can look at it and say, you know what, I know what good looks like based on my knowledge of what this thing does. And then I can build good alerts around that.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So establishing a baseline and then looking and saying, well, if the last 3 days have been defined as good of data collection, then things that are outside that, typically lower than that in performance or increase in that in error rates or things like that, we could call those noteworthy items. We can decide what we want to do about them.
Yeah, and the anomalies are not always accurate. Sometimes it's totally fine that your transactions per minute have dropped or risen sharply. So really the important thing is that you have this data and you're able to look at it and reason about it. Over time, you will continue to tweak this sort of thing until it gets very accurate. And you know for a fact that when something happens, when some metric changes, you know that something's gone wrong.
Great.
It's not something that happens overnight.
That makes sense. Okay, I'm going to open it up. Who's got a question about, golly, there's a lot of observation. Monitoring is a huge topic. Mike did a very brief 5-minute overview. Let's throw some questions at him here, folks.
Come on, bring them on.
Bring them on. Let's make him hard.
Mike, quick one from here. All of this makes sense. I get it. You want to monitor all of your infrastructure. You want to monitor the interaction with your customers. All this really speaks to infrastructure and services that either your company has owned, your company has built, or something in-house, we'll call it. What about external services? Can you speak to the value of monitoring external hosted services that companies rely on, and maybe some techniques to kind of streamline that into more of a centralized place to where your alerts come in? How techniques for monitoring SaaS-based services or hosted services that the companies use for sure?
Yeah, so that one's hard. I was working with a company a while back, and AT&T, they're a conglomerate, so I can talk about them. They were having this problem with their cell systems where the data bus that all the messages go through is run by someone else, but AT&T runs both of the other ends. So their message bus was kind of a black box. So data goes in, something happens, and hopefully data comes out, but we don't actually know. So what I advise them to do is monitor both ends, instrument when data goes in, just get all the data, all the information you possibly can about when that data goes in, and then check it on the other side. So in theory, the data rate should be, the volume of data should be roughly the same. And you can't monitor failures of the bus because you don't have a control over it, but you can monitor symptoms. So that's very similar to monitoring, say, a hosted API, someone else's API that you depend on. You can, in your code that you're calling out to that, you can add instrumentation to that and say, you know, every time that I make a call to this, I want to time it. I want to know how long that API call takes. I want to know every time I invoke it. I want to know what API endpoints I'm hitting and the kinds of data that I'm sending to it. So you track all this information, and you won't be able to really know if the API is broken in a very specific way because you don't have any information into what that implementation looks like. However, you will be able to know that the API is performing poorly, or you know, some things are taking longer because you have latency metrics. You know exactly how long the call normally takes. So if it's usually takes sub-millisecond and now it's taking 1.2, and that's been happening for 5 minutes, you know, there's probably a problem with their API. You can't really do anything about it, but at least you know, which is better than not knowing.
Gotcha.
And that's one of the tricks of depending on a external services. You really do put your business at risk of you're depending on someone else's system that you don't run.
Yep.
That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it should be a decision made consciously. If you do make that decision, then you should also be tracking exactly how they're performing, kind of the trust but verify situation. Like, yes, I trust you to do your business. I trust you that you're going to have this API available to me. It's going to perform well. It's going to work in the way that I want it to work. But by the way, I'm going to monitor everything that I do with it.
Okay.
Does that answer it?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Great. What other questions do we have about monitoring?
I've got a kind of a leading meta question. Who monitors the monitoring systems?
I'm sorry, say that once more.
Who monitors the monitoring systems, or what monitors the monitoring systems? I mean, how do we know the monitoring systems are working correctly? Do you have a monitor on the monitoring systems?
Your monitoring department calls you at 4 a.m. to say, we detected 100% disk usage on mount/CD-ROM. What would you like us to do? And if you know anything about Linux, right, a CD-ROM has always 100%.
So,
I'll shut up now.
Andy, that's a fun question. So Netflix spends tons and tons of money on monitoring. They gave a talk recently. They said that they spend somewhere just less than $66 million a year all in on monitoring. And that's staff and all the engineering effort and all that. So fully loaded cost. But that feels obscene to me. And he said that about half of that is the cost that they spend to monitor their monitoring systems.
Half?
So, yeah, it's a ridiculous number. What you really think about is like, okay, I guess that makes sense, because to monitor a monitoring system well, you're essentially doubling all the infrastructure that you need and all the engineering effort that goes into it. So, yeah, it can be a little silly. That's the extreme. On a smaller end, you can do things like, in the old days, we would run a separate Nagios server to monitor our primary Nagios server. And that works pretty well. And I know some people are doing like, they will use two different SaaS services that check the same thing, and they just dedupe the alerts. And that's a really easy, poor man's way of doing it. You can get really complex. Getting complex is really a engineering decision and a business decision there, and it greatly depends on what your environment looks like. In general, if you're running a pretty simple infrastructure, then I wouldn't worry too much about it, especially if your downside is not that high. Like if you're going to lose $1 million in an hour, then okay, the upside for you not doing that is good. Let's invest in it. But if what you have at risk is like, oh, I might upset a customer, but they're going to be fine with it, then maybe not do that investment, because it's going to be a lot more work. It's going to be a lot more money to do the work.
Yeah. I mean, I'm coming at it because from an agency owner point of view, and what I have and where this all interests me is from the fact that we run lots of things for lots of clients. Yeah. All of them are like all on that relatively small scale. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of trying to work out where we could offer service levels on things and trying to sort of preempt questions. And it's that thing of like, well, I'm just monitoring everything in the same kind of way, but do I know if this stuff is even working, and monitoring the kind of thing.
So one approach I've seen work with agencies, managed service providers do it this way generally. They will have one monitoring system per customer, and then have a central system that not only aggregates all that information, but also monitors those monitoring systems.
Yeah, makes sense.
I'm curious about this because you brought it up, Andy, maybe Mike, I don't know if you have any thoughts on it. How do you position and sell monitoring to a client who assumes that everything ought to just work? And, you know, like, how often do things really break? And I mean, like, the world's generally a pretty great place and nothing bad ever really happens. And so why when we go to a client, or we even talk to our stakeholders about this monitoring investment, how do we make the case for that? Because it seems like at some point somebody might say to us, well, just build it right and bad things won't happen, right?
Yeah. In that situation, I liken it to a car. It's like, sure, you bought the BMW, but you woke up this morning and the BMW didn't start. Did BMW build it wrong? Like, why'd you buy a bad car? You should have bought a better car. It's like, well, clearly that's absurd.
Yeah, maybe BMW is just really an awful car with good branding, which isn't true, right?
Right. And your customer knows that. It's like, well, you know, I bought a good car because I think well of myself.
Yes.
So
right.
So, like, I think I make good decisions, therefore the car that I bought is a good decision. And if the car doesn't work, that's not because I made a bad decision. It's because, you know, the car doesn't work. It breaks sometimes. The wear and tear of this thing breaks. Software is not this thing that exists in a vacuum. Software exists in the real world and has lots and lots of dependencies. And we don't control those dependencies. We don't know how those dependencies are going to behave. Much like the roads that we drive on. Like, yeah, the road has a pothole this morning because the rain washed out. There's nothing I can do about that. I don't control the road, but I'm still driving the car. The car's still got to work, and, you know, it just blew a tire thanks to that. That's not my fault. But if I could monitor that sort of thing, then, you know, life gets better. So monitoring is one of those things of, you sell it not on the, we wrote something shitty and now we have to make sure that our crappy code doesn't break. It's like, no, failure is inevitable. It will happen. There is no such thing as 100% working thing all the time. So monitoring makes sure that we catch those 1% of failures that are going to occur.
And 1% is a big number.
Yeah, 1% is a big number. We would rather catch the minute failures that are going to occur before your customers catch them.
Great. Yeah, I like that. I do think that there's a difference in attitude. I've always seen sysadmins as being incredibly worried about the 1% because it's what in on the weekends and the evenings and cause them so much stress. And yet programmers are like, well, it's just going to be fine because software isn't even real. It's not like a real machine that needs oiling. And so this idea of everything breaks, nothing is perfect, and the dependency on stuff that you can't control at all seems like the right sort of mindset that really makes monitoring such an important topic. Let's see if we've got other questions. John, Jordan, Paul, William, Tim, or even Andy. What monitoring questions or problems come to mind here?
Oh, I'm waiting for the SLA discussion.
Okay. Well, we'll get to that in just a minute.
I see 15 different items on here. Aggregation techniques. How do you not look at 15 different places to get your information? How do I get it behind a single pane of glass? And that might be more of a business specific question, but techniques?
So you really don't.
Ouch.
Yeah. So there's really no such thing as the, excuse me. There's no such thing as a single pane of glass that gives me everything I want to know. You're not going to get a single tool. What you can get are different tools that will roll up into a single tool. Like, say, you might have a visualization layer that provides visualization of all the data that you're putting into it. So things like Graphite and Grafana associated with that, you can roll up all the data that comes out of Nagios and Datadog and SolarWinds into this one visualization tool. So if you care about what your dashboards look like, then that's the place to go. If you are looking for like specific log entries where you're looking for really detailed data on some idea that you already know about, then going into your logging tool to look for it is probably where you want to be. But you don't necessarily need to be in all of these tools at all the time, because they serve different purposes. They're for answering different questions.
Is this where the idea of knowing your baseline, and do all these tools allow for alerts, which don't
most of them? So these are all examples of the kinds of tools. I tried to base it on
tools.
Yeah, this is not all tools by far. There are literally thousands of examples. I tried to go with the ones that I thought everyone here would have an idea of.
Sure. I feel like maybe Tim realized his life is going to be spent flipping between a dozen different screens now.
So as an engineering manager, you probably don't care about mixed panel and Google Analytics. Those are going to be things like your conversion funnels. Marketing is going to care a lot about those. That's helpful to know, especially if you could tie those in some way. Things like New Relic and App Dynamics are really great for software engineers at the code instrumentation level. And you might care about, as an engineering manager, you might care deeply about that. You probably care about everything underneath that too. Server and application, and in some cases, front-end / browser monitoring can be in the same tools or the same suite of tools. Like New Relic has an entire suite of tools that do just that. Like it's New Relic APM and New Relic browser, and I think they have New Relic infrastructure, and they all are tools that work together. You can do this with Datadog as well. Datadog has Datadog APM, and then the classic Datadog all integrate together. So really you can roll up the data in whatever tools you want, especially if you have some sort of dashboarding component that you can use. But in general, all these are for asking and answering different questions and may not have a lot of overlap.
Okay. All right. One final call. We can come back to monitoring later, but I'd say let's move on to SLAs. And with that, let's find out about what this TLA of an SLA actually is.
All right. Okay, there we go. So SLAs, as I mentioned, it's essentially a promise to perform to some level. There are generally two types. There's an availability SLA and a response SLA. So the availability SLA is we promise to be up like 95.5% availability. And this is generally measured over a month span. This is a tricky one to actually implement, and we'll get into that in a bit. But this is one of the most common. For people who do a lot of support, there's the response SLA. We promise to respond to requests within some certain time period, like within 30 minutes. This one's pretty easy to implement.
Mike, give us is there a way to give us, maybe this is a silly idea, but just to make this really clear between the difference of these two, is there any metaphor with the BMW car again? Like, the response one reminds me of, if you have a flat tire, we'll be there in 30 minutes or less.
Yeah, it's like AAA. If you have a AAA membership, they promise to respond. They don't promise to be there, but they promise to respond within some certain time period. But the availability metric, that one's harder on a car, because that is essentially the car saying we promise that this car will work up to this amount.
99.5% of the time you go to start this car, the first time it will start. And of course, No one would ever buy a car with a 0.5% failure rate off the lot, right? That would be considered crazy.
Exactly. And it's actually a lot like hard drives. There's this idea of the bathtub curve, where failures. So a bathtub curve looks like this, and it's over time. So failures mostly happen either at the very beginning, and then after about 6 months, it starts to do this, where there are very, very low rates of failures, and then suddenly at the end of life, they spike again. Cars are a lot like that as well. The software isn't actually like that. Software becomes more stable over time. So you don't have that particular problem, but the infrastructure the availability of infrastructures where this often comes into of this server is going to be up. It's going to be working for this amount of time. And it sounds great to say like, oh yeah, of course I can provide that because like that's easy to do. Well, not really, because then you have to be able to, your infrastructure has to be able to support having the application up, and you have to be able to report on it. And this is where people get into trouble. So if you have to be able to report down to the minute of when you have failures in order to support, I think, a 99.9% availability. You have to be able to report down to the minute. So if you don't have monitoring around your application that can report at that granular level, then you cannot possibly prove that you have that availability level, which means you can't sell it.
Okay, you used an interesting word, prove. I have a feeling we're going to come back to that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So these are the two SLA types. As agency owners, you selling the response time SLA is it's the easiest. And it's the most straightforward. Your customers are going to really understand it. But if you're selling the SaaS service, selling the availability metric, selling the availability of SLA is really, it can be dangerous because it's a lot of overhead that has to go into your infrastructure and how you work, how you manage things. So there's a lot more work that goes into it than initially looks like at the outset. So SLA mistakes, the availability metric, the availability SLA, guaranteeing a higher availability than you can provide. This comes back to what I was saying earlier of you can't provide a higher availability than you can actually report on. So you need to be able to prove that your availability is what it is, because when your customer comes to you and says, hey, we were down, what do? Especially if you have a penalty clause where you say, if you come to us and like we were down for X amount of time, then we pay you because we broke our SLA. Well, if the customer comes and says, hey, you were down, what are you going to say if you weren't down? Are you going to come back and be like, no, we weren't down, and like get into an argument with your customer? Or are you going to come back and say, no, here's an exhaustive set of data that says we weren't down? And that only works if you actually have all this data that you can prove that, no, everything was working fine, which goes back to earlier of how do you ensure that the application is working at a granular level? So using Pingdom to make sure that you're up when you're trying to sell an availability SLA is not enough. You really need to get into instrumenting the application, paying attention to transactions per second, things like that, something much more granular. Otherwise, you'll never be able to prove that the SLA that you're selling is actually a viable SLA. So on the response time, the biggest mistake here I see is guaranteeing a resolution time. You can, if I say I'm selling you a 30-minute response time, what that actually means is that within 30 minutes, I'm going to respond to your request. That doesn't mean I'm going to fix your request. If you sell someone on a 1 hour resolution, it's like, well, most things probably take less than an hour and you win. But what about those things that take more than an hour? The things that are unforeseen, which is the entire point of you providing support, is that eventually you're going to run into things that are really complex. And the nature of doing software is that we can't anticipate how long something's going to take, because this is uncharted waters. This is really complex stuff. So if you sell the resolution time, I can almost guarantee you that at some point you're going to break it, at which point now you have to pay out. But the whole point of the SLA is that you perform better, or meets expectations on your SLA, so that you don't have to pay out. So if you promise a resolution time, you're shooting yourself in the foot. So that's all I've prepared for the SLAs. I expect there's going to be a lot of questions on this.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So how common is it for a small team to provide an SLA that is for response time? Not resolution time, but response time. And how do people, like, I've always approached SLAs as something I'm just not going to talk about. Yeah, I'm always on call. I'm always available to pick up the phone. I'll always try to get a developer if I can't figure it out myself to respond. But I try to not talk about it because I'm afraid if I talk about it, I've got to kind of admit, yeah, we're really not equipped too well to handle a real SLA. So how do people actually approach this in the real world?
So if you don't have SLAs now, then the best way that I've seen to really get into it and start talking about it is there are two other metrics that you can think about. There's the service level indicator. This is the metric that you decide you're going to measure. So in this case, my response time would be my indicator. And then you have the service level objective. The objective is I want to respond to all requests within 15 minutes. And then the SLA is actually optional. The SLA is the agreement. It's something in writing. It's something that has a contractual clawback, or it has contractual force. An SLO, the service level objective, is just me saying, this is what I'm trying to hit.
But if I say I have this objective, it's expected I'm going to work to put in place process that will achieve that objective.
So the objective is not something that you can define on your own unilaterally. Defining the objective is something you do with the team of why should we have a 15-minute response time? What does that get us? Should it be 45 minutes? What actually goes into providing a quicker response time? How much more work is it? And is it actually beneficial to us and the customers? If it requires 10x investment to go from 30 minutes to 15 minutes, but we only get 5x the revenue, then why bother? So you don't just decide yourself that I'm going to do a 30-minute response time and track that. It's something that you really have to discuss.
But can you realistically do it with a small team without kind of alienating a developer?
Not really. So any team under about 10 or so, it's hard to provide a good response time SLA or hit anything, just because the amount of work that everyone's expected to do. There's going to be a lot of people doing double duties on a lot of different jobs. So it's difficult to provide that response time. And I would argue that it's probably not that useful anyways.
Interesting. You mentioned this, and so John, let me just ask this question because it might be related. I think I know the answer, but these agreements, these discussions, SLA, SLI, SLO, and I'd never heard of the I and the O. I think that's really interesting as a way to start having some of these discussions that are so easy to avoid from the frame of mind that we're just going to be optimistic and hope nothing goes wrong and stuff like that. But you mentioned these agreements. I'm assuming who are these agreements between? Because any kind of agreement, whether it's informal or contractual, requires two parties.
Yeah. So generally, SLAs are between you and a customer.
Okay.
In large companies, you can have SLAs between you and internal teams, but even that's not common. Most of the time, you're going to have what people have always just dubbed an informal SLA. It's really an SLO of if I say to another team, hey, I run this API that you depend on, you can expect response times of 2 milliseconds for 99% of requests. And you can expect failure rates of less than 0.5% for 99.5% of requests. That's an SLO. And if I add a contractual force to it, then maybe that makes it an SLA. But in general, internally, the SLA doesn't really do anything, or at least if it does, there's no contractual clause to it. There's
one department's not going to sue another department of the same company, probably.
Exactly. One of the things I've always found suspect about SLAs is that they have this penalty that comes with it. It's, we're going to provide this service or else. And it's the or else that frustrates me, because let's say that breach of SLA means that I have to give you a month credit for service. Well, you're paying a very low amount compared to your revenue for service, ideally, which means that you would actually have preferred to just not go down. Like, if you're paying me $1,000 a month for service and you're making $100,000 a month in revenue, that depends on the service that I'm providing, and I just come back and it's like, here's your money back for the month. You're like, well, that's great. I lost $100,000. Right. I would rather have you not gone down.
Right.
So the SLA of here's some money back, that's pretty stupid. Like, it doesn't actually help anyone. It makes the customer feel good until you actually have a breach, and then they're just really upset, even though you're now compliant with the SLA you signed.
So SLO is a service level objective. I'm sorry, I'm taking notes here. And SLI was a service level indicator?
Indicator. So on the indicator, it is a measurement that you decide that measures whatever that objective is. So maybe on the idea of the API, that could be latency or latency on requests. So that's the indicator. You may have multiple indicators.
Okay. John, I don't know if we got your question answered. I think it was around team size and what's realistic. Sounded like Mike felt like small teams, because of all the different kinds of work that each people had to do, it was very difficult to actually enforce or provide with confidence an SLA. John, did you have any more thoughts? I want to make sure I didn't derail your question.
So what do people actually do in practice? Those with small teams who have clients who have critical solutions, but where you don't have a 10-person team working on that with that one client, how do you actually in practice provide something that gives the client that kind of warm and fuzzy feeling like you've got their back?
Generally, this one's hard, because the answer I'm going to give you is exactly what I've seen and doesn't actually help. You tell the client best effort. Like, you say, look, I'm a small company. I'm not going to be able to provide you with a contractual response time because I am a small company. However, because I'm a small company, I very much want to keep you happy. Your business is extremely important to me, much more than, say, if you went out and hired Accenture or Deloitte. Like, yeah, they're going to give you 500 people and a guaranteed response time. I'm not. When you want me, you call me. I pick up the phone. Now, it may take me 15 minutes or it may take me 2 hours, but you're going to get me. When was the last time you got the CEO of Accenture on the phone?
So that idea of having a candid conversation about best effort and realistic expectations.
Right.
I suppose one problem could be to say, well, we're on Amazon and they have a 99.99% uptime, so everything's great. Of course, that really has nothing to do with your uptime, right? I've seen that. I've sold that in the past and wished I hadn't. Or I've told people that in the past and wished I hadn't.
Right. I'm pulling up a chart. I can never remember these metrics, but you mentioned the EC2.
I did, yes.
Where'd that chart go? So EC2 just increased themselves from 3.5 nines, which is 99.95%, to 4 nines of availability. In a year, that equates to being down 52 minutes.
So can I ask another? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So 52 minutes is a long time.
A year, yeah.
Yeah, like
for an entire service or region or whatever. Yeah.
Right. Like, imagine if EC2 was entirely down for almost an hour. And the way that these sorts of failures tend to happen is that, it all happens at once. So.
Okay. All right. John,
you were about to ask a question.
And then I actually wanted to ask a question for some of the folks who didn't own, who weren't service companies, see if they had any question, because I think there's another interesting perspective here. Go ahead, John.
So this is kind of related, but how do people actually calculate uptime? Not uptime that has happened, but how does Amazon say for EC2 we have 4 nines of uptime? How do they figure out what that actually is? How do they project out that?
Yeah. So when you're monitoring it, when you decide what the metrics are that makes the system work, so for EC2 it's actually going to be multiple metrics. And then from there, you're monitoring, because of the size of their infrastructure, they're not monitoring individual servers, they're monitoring the service. So EC2 is not one service, it's probably like a dozen that all provide distinct services behind them. So things like launching an instance would be one service. Managing the elastic load balancers would be a different service. So all of those, you would then be paying attention to things like, let's say the example of load balancers. I want to know how much traffic is going through them. I want to know, are the security groups working? And how could I tell this is something like, what's the ratio of hit versus miss on security groups? So how often do I allow things through? How often do I deny things? And over the aggregate, that's going to remain pretty constant.
So the only way to predict future uptime is to calculate past uptime and try to extrapolate. Is that what you're saying?
Kind of. The problem is you can't really predict future uptime.
How does Amazon say we're moving from 3 nines to 4 nines? How do they?
It's one of those things of they've provided a SLA to their customers for years of 3.5 nines. And probably what they've done here is they've gone back and looked at everything they've done and said, well, for the most part, we exceed 3.5 nines. So we're now comfortable shooting for 4 nines. We may not always make it, but it's probably a bit of a stretch, but they feel comfortable getting there. So it's not really that they're projecting, it's that they've decided that they're comfortable giving that now. SLAs are one of those things of it's hopes and dreams. Like okay. you hope that you're able to provide a service up to this level, but you don't know for sure because you can't predict the future. You know what the past has looked like, and you can make some investment to make your service more reliable so that you can provide this increased level of service, but you don't know what the future is going to hold. We could all have an S3 outage again, and the whole game's over. Everyone go home because we're getting no work done. And inside of that one outage, everyone blew completely through every SLA they have.
Well, it sounds like everyone talks about uptime as this concrete number. We provide X percentage of uptime, and it sounds like it has a lot of specificity, and it doesn't sound like it really does in reality. It's more of a goal rather than, we've really calculated this uptime. Yeah.
So everyone will calculate what uptime internally means differently. And what they will say to the customer is that the app will be up. And the customer doesn't actually care what that means generally. But things like, if I'm not able to launch an instance, is that the service being down? Does Amazon call that down? Or because the instances that are already there are running and everything else works, do they call that available?
So there's a lot of nuance in the definition, of course, of these broad concepts like up and down.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's very unbinary, like a machine being on or off, right?
Yeah.
Let me do this. Let me derail this a little bit, if
Sure.
that's okay. I'm curious. I know we've got Michael here, and he runs an internal team at a SaaS. And Jordan and Paul, forgive me, we haven't met yet, but I'm curious for the folks who don't deal with clients and client services. And I know Tim, you also, you manage a lot of other systems. Are there any questions about SLA, SLI, SLO, or monitoring when the client's out of the picture and you're really trying to provide a service to, say, to SaaS customers or other people who depend on you for their business? I just kind of wanted to throw it out there from the different perspective as well.
Right. So one of the things that I find really daunting to deal with is we've built sort of agency around a middleman relationship. And so we will take goods from somewhere else and then bring them over to the customer. Mm-hmm. And despite our best efforts to be available all the time, sometimes the supplier of those goods is not. At the end of the day, the customer looks at us and says it didn't work, but it's not really our fault. So I was wondering how you thought through some of those challenges around representing availability and maybe having both of those sides of the story so that we can figure out where we need to invest.
Yeah. So what your customer cares about is that they have the goods. What you care about is your supplier giving you the goods and, ultimately you delivering them. But your constraint is on your supplier and their constraint is on you. So any SLA you provide to the customer, you would have to take into account the availability of your dependency.
Right.
You can only be as available as your lowest dependency. So if half the time your supplier screws up and delivers late, then you can only provide a 50% SLA to the customer because you can't deliver more often than that. And that sounds awful to the customer, so you're never going to say anything about it. That's terrible, but that's how the SLAs work. Is if, like with Amazon, if I have the EC2 provides that 4 nines availability, therefore I cannot provide a 5 nines SLA to my customers because what I depend on has a lower availability than that. It's your situation too. So your problem, like where you should fix, is not really at the SLA area, but how can you solve that problem? How can you solve the supply problem without just yelling at the vendor? Like perhaps you could stock more stuff and solve it that way, so that when they have supply problems, it doesn't necessarily affect your ability to deliver. And then you can start to think about SLAs. SLAs generally, if I'm making a promise, I'm going to charge you for it, and I'm probably going to charge you handsomely for it. So you could finance solving that problem of I'm now buying a big stock of stuff. I have inventory of these goods, and you finance it with selling that SLA.
Got it.
Does that answer the question?
Yep. I'm going to see if we can make that happen in our industry, but very helpful. Thanks.
Yep.
Can I ask a related question? You just mentioned, Mike, financing it, financing the additional goods through an SLA, right? Can you finance the lack of a team through an SLA? Have you seen that before, where somebody essentially uses the SLA, what they make from the SLA to kind of build a monitoring?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm signing a new contract, and that's generally when the SLA is going to come into force, is on the new contract, then I'm going to increase the amount of money that I'm charging them for by virtue of giving them a promise. That promise is going to cost them a lot more money. So I'm just going to take that extra money and use that to staff out my team, or to make an investment, or to do whatever I want with it. But that additional money from the new service I'm providing is going to allow me to do something. Now, I don't like selling things that I don't actually have. And I know companies that do, and it's fine, but it feels ethically murky to me. So what I would do is, instead of selling something and just not telling the customer I don't have that yet, I would sell it with some requirement of the contract that I have it within X amount of time. So let's say I'm signing a new year contract. They're going to pay me an additional $10,000 a month for service. I would say in the contract that you're going to pay me for this, but I have to have this in place within a month. And that gives me time to actually ramp up and get the people in there. Or you just you eat the first month yourself. And it's like, let's say you sign the contract and you say, well, the first month is going to be normal price, and the next 11 months are going to be at this increased rate. And that first month is you take your own reserves, staff out the team, and then use the additional capital later to continue to do it.
From a business perspective, have you seen that actually done in real organizations?
Yeah. Yep.
They use the SLA to build out a larger team.
Yeah.
The SLA requirements to build out a larger team.
Mm-hmm.
But you still feel like 10 is that kind of cutoff point between when you have...
10 feels like the right number to me. It's actually it's a lot more nuanced than that, of how the company works, what the company's doing, how streamlined it is. There's a lot that goes into when the right time is.
Because responding in 15 minutes when everything's fine or when you're at a computer is not a big deal.
Exactly.
Responding in 15 minutes when you're getting married or when you're, doing something really important, that's a big deal. And a lot of times things don't break when it's most convenient.
Right. Yeah, and that's the hard one. Responding within 15. So you could say things like, I promise to respond within 15 minutes, X% of the time. And think about all requests in the aggregate.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah. So that one works pretty well, but if you have unsophisticated customers, then they'll look at that and be like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why, if I'm not going to call you that often. Like I may call you once a year, and now my aggregate is 1. And if you don't respond for 3 hours, then I'm screwed. So depending on the kinds of customers you're working with, that may go over well. Sophisticated companies like enterprise companies or even medium-sized businesses, they'll be fine with that sort of thing, because if they're paying for that SLA, they're expecting to use it.
Okay, so last question for right now. But has anyone here ever just taken a small team and forced on-call requirements down their throats? And how well did that go?
Andy does a lot of maintenance.
Yeah, I dodged that. I mean, I don't think after today's discussion so far, I thought of things as SLAs, but I don't think they really are SLAs. The most we do in any of our support contracts is like, we deliberately keep it between like the 9 till 5 kind of thing. And it's mostly around just responding to phone calls. Our caveat is that we say a response. We definitely at least don't do the resolution time. I was always like, I'm not guaranteeing any kind of resolution time, but it's 4 hours response if you phone us, we'll guarantee to respond, which we're always going to do when they phone. We're going to pick up the phone.
Wait, that's during business hours, or that's in the middle of the...
Yeah, that's purely just business hours, yeah. And we avoid like public holidays as well for the same reasons, because we're too small a team.
So people are just dodging SLAs altogether then, if there's...
Yeah, basically. Yeah, I called it that, or the clients call it that, but I think that is really what Mike's saying. Is that,
I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a really responsive guy. My guys are too. I'm not trying to...
I think it's a per client thing though, because it depends on what the client's needs are and their levels of support. That's the way I look at it. And as you have it as a graded system, it's like, well, if it's a high priority, we'll respond to it within 4 hours. If it's something that's low priority, well, if it's only affecting one user and they can't really do something, but the application's up and that kind of stuff, that's an 8-hour response time. We don't need to respond to that in any meaningful way. And I think that was one kind of general question I had in terms of like, at least from this service company perspective, it's that, well, what constitutes a response? Because a phone call, if they phone us and we pick it up, we've responded. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's a 0 response time in that sense. Whereas if they email it, as long as we send an email reply within 4 or 8 hours, again, we're within those sort of the terms we specified, which I called an SLA, but I don't think I will anymore. I think that's more, it's definitely in that sort of SLO area.
Yep. Absolutely.
And I think it's always going to be very sort of variable depending on client and what they need. And then it's just not over-promising what you can't deliver. And I think it's things like the availability where I never promise any of that sort of stuff to a client for for those sort of reasons, like I said, that we're very dependent on those providers and we have no control over them. So
something you mentioned about priorities that I want to hit on there is when you separate things into low priority, medium, and high priority, by virtue of the customer calling you, they think their issue is high priority. They may mark it as low priority, but they think it's high priority. Like that's how they work. So especially if the customer says, this is high priority, and then you come back and say, no, that's actually medium. Now the customer hates you. Like, they're like, well, who are you to say that my thing is not as important as I think it is? So to them, at that point, they don't really care about the SLA, and you've just used the SLA to beat them over the head. So be very careful about using priorities externally with the customer and setting SLAs or response times around priorities, because it's not really going to bite you from the implementation side. Just from the customer service side, it's not going to make the customer feel great.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. You have to talk to them about what priority means, so there isn't a surprise about that.
Yeah, and that adds a lot of overhead for you, and that also adds a lot of overhead for them. For me, I would rather the customer just send me the request, and I will decide how to handle it. I will decide what that priority is. The more detail the customer provides allows me to decide what the priority is, but I generally don't like having them decide, especially if it's tied to some sort of response structure.
Yeah, I mean, for us, sorry, I was going to just my last little bit on that was more the I think the fact that you've replied saying we've categorized it as something. Yeah. Would you classify that as that's the response? So you've hit that SLA in that sort of sense of, well, we have responded, that's dealt with. Whether we actually deal with it quicker or that becomes a separate question later.
Right. And that's where the resolution comes in. There's this one particular metric called a mean time to response, and it's often used in large help desks. And the idea is that over the aggregate, you look at what is the mean time for me responding to a request, but that doesn't actually say where I'm at in that request lifecycle. It doesn't say if the request is finished. It just says my first time to responding to it. That's the number that I care about. And it's a misleading number, because all it actually tells you, what it incentivizes is people to very quickly respond to an issue so that they change that clock from the response clock to a different clock.
It's an acknowledgement clock.
Right.
Can you do that as kind of something that's even below a service level objective? Just an acknowledgement clock?
You can, but we're really talking the same thing there of if you decide that response time is what you care about, then that's the acknowledgement. Like I'm responding to you, therefore I have met the agreed upon service level. And if the customer cares about that, that's great. But if they don't, well, why are you bothering with it?
Let me ask this, because there was a question in chat. It wasn't really a question. It was kind of a discussion. Paul was mentioning they're a payments company. And they are limited by the upstream folks. And I wasn't exactly sure, but as payments, my guess is they integrate with banks or credit card validation or blah, 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 all kinds of stuff. Sounds a lot like Mike, where you've got upstream dependencies, which impact the kind of SLA that you can provide. So we were kind of just chatting about there, and he mentioned this idea that the customers are asking for real-time information that they are struggling to provide. Can an SLA, SLO, be granular enough, for example, to say, you know what, I'm just going to make something up because I know nothing about payments. Oh, for a charge to go through, we have a 99 point, we have this kind of SLA, but to get this kind of information about sales, we have a different SLA, because we know that we're not going to get that data. Sounded like Paul mentioned, like for 24 hours is the cycle on that. Mm-hmm. Can we have different SLAs, different promises? I feel like at the end of the day, what we're doing is proactively promising And we're being in good faith saying we think we can promise this within this time frame, and we could again say availability and response. But this kind of data is different, and so let's create different conversations and different expectations about it. Maybe we have a whole set of different kinds of data that the same customer cares about, but we're not just saying we're up as in 100% of everything is available, but instead we're saying this sort of thing's available all, at 99.9, and this is updated nightly. So that's a very different sort of data. I don't know. I'm just sort of throwing an idea out here. And
no, sure.
By the way, Paul, feel free to jump in because I probably have mangled this.
No, I'm sorry. I'm kind of hiding behind my name there. You don't see me. The conversation's been good. What I'm trying to understand is there's this aspect of what's contractual versus what we just say. Like, so we have this API we provide to developers. They can get this data. They're more and more wanting something real time, right? They want this information real time because, you talk about it. We're talking about transactions. This is financial. There's an expectation that, in this world now that, if I have a charge, I'm going to see it immediately, especially with their banks and stuff. And so for us, we want to be able to start to do that. But upstream providers that give us this data, they do it. We do it in a way with them that I can tell you guys that we do it in a way that we can only get it 24 hours. And so if it's, is that fine? We just leave it 24 hours to actually provide an SLA. It almost seems economically infeasible to start to promise these uptimes that are going to be greater than, shorter than 24 hours because it would change our relationship with them. So I'm just wondering, is it even worth it?
Let me make sure that I understand that situation. Yeah. Your upstream provider only provides you data for the past 24 hours in an aggregate.
Yes.
And your developers want to know real time.
Yes.
Okay. So no, the problem there is that the data that you're being provided isn't granular enough for you to give to the developers. So you can't really help them with that.
Right.
Yeah, like it's unfortunately. So to answer the question that Marcus kind of put in your mouth to a little bit of, can you have some sort of agreement around granular level things of different API endpoints and different functionality? Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with that. Your problem is actually slightly different in that the data that you need to provide isn't the data they want. Right, isn't data you can get.
Well, they want it. It's just it's not fast enough. It's not in a form that they get. They want it in a obviously down to like close to the minute in terms.
Yeah.
Of,
so,
yeah.
And your provider doesn't provide that. So, yeah, there's not a lot you can do with that. One option is you can pull all this information from your provider on a historical basis and look and just track that over time. And then you can tell your developers that, like, here's the data, here's a dashboard of historical data. It's updated every 24 hours.
Right.
And this, you can clearly see this is what their performance is usually. But your provider doesn't provide the data that you want. So there's not a lot you can do there.
Right.
I would have a discussion with your provider and see what you can change about that.
There has been discussions. I mean, just to be forthright, it would cost a lot of money to change that relationship.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And so the way we've done it is it's worked now, but again, in this world it's changing. So the SLA to me seems just at this point economically infeasible.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Well, and maybe, I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah. No, and to your point, I think sometimes you could have, so there's going to be different dimensions of this API. Some of it, we can get it from other providers, but is it really, I mean, is it getting confusing to like have, say, one endpoint or one particular area of the API to be under an SLA and another? I guess you could do that and you line that out in your developer agreement and everything like that.
Yeah. So are these internal developers?
No, these would be external. These are actually external companies.
Gotcha. So I will amend my answer slightly.
That's fine.
When you're providing an SLA, an agreement, this is the promise. This is the thing that you're holding yourself to. So I'd be careful how much you hold yourself to. If you start breaking it down by API endpoints to the customer, one, that's really tricky for you. Like, it adds a lot of overhead for you, especially on the reporting side.
Right.
Remember that any SLA you have to be able to prove that you can do that. So tracking that down to an endpoint is pretty difficult. Like, it's a lot more work. And two, it's going to confuse the customer.
Right.
If these are internal developers, the situation is slightly different in that they understand the intricacies that go into that API. So you can say, here's the performance level of each individual endpoint, and it's not really a promise at that point. It's not an agreement. This is just the performance. This is what we hope to get to. This is what we try to maintain, but this is what it is.
Yeah. If I may add too, there's an additional pressure too as part of selling this product or service to these external companies. Business likes the idea of being able to provide a SLA. It's a selling point, obviously, and so that's kind of the tension that we're dealing with here. Is we're trying to find a way to do that and do it. Again, I use the two words economically feasible. I mean, I keep coming up with that. So
no, I think you're right. It sounds like it's pretty straightforward here in that the thing your customer wants is the thing that you can't get from your supplier. So you should have the conversation with the supplier. In this situation, it's going to cost you significantly more money to get that information from your supplier. And will the customer pay more than that to have it?
Right, exactly. You've got it. Yeah, in a nutshell.
It almost makes me wonder. I mean, we're talking about SLAs as a contractual item. We're talking about SLI and SLOs. I mean, it makes me think that if you don't have a contractual SLA, then what you have is an SLA that stands for a service level assumption. And that is the thing that the customer assumes is going to happen as they enter into an agreement with you, whether you're building them custom software or providing a service or an API. If you don't talk about it, then you have a service level assumption.
No, you're right.
It seems like. So there's always something that starts, acronym of SLA at play. And maybe the tricky part is where to talk about it and where to not, or if not, and, I'm a big fan of talking about everything, because I feel like that in the moment something bad happens, either they're falling back on the service level agreement or on the service level assumption, or maybe you've been able to proactively communicate, Paul, and I have no idea if this is useful, to be able to say, well, we don't provide an SLA, but we do provide you with statistics that show our uptime and performance on a monthly basis so that you see trends. And while there is no legal agreement in place, but we are monitoring, that shows you're taking care of business, and we will provide to you a report that shows you made this many calls, that this was the average call time.
Right.
I'm just sort of talking out loud here. That seems like it provides a sense that you are being very responsible and responsive to the system, even though it's past history.
No, and I like that. It's in a sense that you almost go through this life cycle of stages as you move towards that holy grail of the SLA. I think there's things that we could do. That's very helpful. You're right. We could, in a sense, we could go to business and say, listen, we can provide these data points. We have this monitoring in place. We can't contractually provide, like guarantee anything, but today this is what we can give to them. And as we move to that point, as things become, they become strong enough that we get that momentum, potentially then we can actually get that data from the upstream provider. We can put more pressure and hopefully things can change. But I like that. Essentially it's a set of stages as we move towards that.
And that might actually allow sales to say, well, we don't have an SLA, but we can provide you with the last 6 months average of what the uptime has been. That is a confidence builder. That is a risk mitigation tool pre-sales, right? To show somebody that not only are you transparent, but you are recording things. I don't know, maybe past history. At some point, we all think that the past will repeat itself. So if you have a good track record, it doesn't mean you can't be in a contract for it, but it also doesn't mean you have to get the sale.
All right.
And Rackspace and a lot of other companies have like status pages where they'll show all their services and what the status of those are and the history of events that have happened. So that could be a good sales tool if you have a good track record of letting your sales guys show that page and show, we really don't have many issues, or this is how we track everything so that up to the minute what's going on.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that a lot of service providers. It's great. We use Azure for a lot of our cloud stuff, and they have a very similar sort of thing. They have a set of metrics so we can look if things are up and down and how long they've been up and down and what the issues were. So, okay, guys,
I feel like
thank you.
that's a confidence building tool. Oh, well,
Yeah.
there's no SLA, but right here, you can see they haven't had an outage in 3 months. That's, or a latency over, 250 milliseconds on this, whatever it is. Like, we can see the history looks good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'm curious, Mike, are you still with us?
I'm here.
Oh, are you still there, Mike?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I was just curious because I feel like this conversation sort of threaded in with your question. Does this apply at all to your world?
Sorry, say that again.
I was just curious, Mike, if the discussion we had around the payment, Paul's problem of having an upstream provider, I was curious if that threaded into your question or was helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of those things of, it does.
Okay. All right. So let's see here. What other questions do we have for Mike? We've got a few minutes left. Could be on SLAs, could be on monitoring. How do we get started? I don't know. If you have an SLA in place, maybe you need to get out of it because now you're not as confident in it because the world S3 could go down and the world could change. What other topics do we want to hit on in the last few minutes?
There was an article that came out just yesterday from the folks at Basecamp who had been providing an SLA for their enterprise customers for a while. And they actually stopped providing SLAs just yesterday. They said, we're not going to do it anymore. And the reason that they came to was like, look, we're not an enterprise company. Why are we providing an enterprise tier to begin with? And they said that the tip-off for them was the enterprise tier of their product was the standard tier plus a few goodies thrown in. It's like, well, wait a minute. Like, that's not a big differentiator. And one of those things was this SLA. And that SLA, it required so much more overhead for them to implement and ensure that they were meeting that it just wasn't worth it. Sure, they probably made a bit more money off of it, maybe a lot more money, but who knows? To them, it's like this wasn't worth offering because our customers don't really care about it. Our customers are mostly small business and solo practitioners. So why are we providing this?
Interesting.
So one of the important things to remember about SLAs is it is very much a business decision. And you don't have to provide it. In a lot of cases, customers just don't care. Like, yeah, they want you to be up, but a lot of customers can't tell the difference between, say, like 99% availability and 98, especially if like they're not in this all day long.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So on that note, the all day long, I was actually presenting to the upper tiers of management an error budget. And I came to the conclusion that the downtime that we have per minute doesn't cost much.
Yeah.
And the value of protecting that downtime from a revenue perspective would be pretty small, considering the effort that we'd need to put in. And I kind of worked it backwards, and I'm like, we could have 75% uptime and we would still be pretty happy with that.
Very nice.
But the amount of stress that people would have inside the office would be pretty high. And what I came to the conclusion of was it seems like there's an emotional aspect to all of this, that the people who bring the deals to the table, those relationships that we try and keep available for our customers to purchase, that might not be represented in that financial figure.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any kind of recommendation to make. I don't know if it's like an emotional level agreement or something like that. But I can imagine the sales guy who comes in and works so hard to get this deal, we integrate it, and then after that, we're down for a certain amount of time. That costs us, I don't know, $100 for the amount of for an hour, and then we would need to put X many engineers on it to actually figure it out, assess the issue, and then that $100 disappears real quick, right? But that salesperson then lost the confidence that they had in being able to sell whatever goods in that period. Is there a way that you think about that on team impact, morale, and sort of weave that into a financial value, if you will, so that we can go from 75%, which, as an engineer, I would never be proud of. But if I'm just justifying it to someone that's in the finance industry, seems like a very reasonable trade-off to get to break even between me doing something else and me investigating that fire.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I love that you brought up the idea of error budgets. For everyone else on the call, if you're not familiar with an error budget, it's the idea of we give ourselves permission to be down or to have a problem for X amount of time. And what this really plays out to is if your engineers are afraid of shipping for fear of the site going down, then they're not going to ship. They're not going to do the risky things that are actually going to improve the business. So error budgets, they're awesome. Basically the inverse of the SLA. So on the emotional side, it's really fascinating because you're right. As someone who prides myself on my ability to run complex infrastructures, if my infrastructure has a 60% availability, I kind of take that a little personally. Like, what am I doing here? Am I even good at my job? But as a business owner, if I think, well, 60% availability, if I go to 70%, I don't make more money. In fact, it may cost me more money to go to 70%. So why bother? And on this, from salesperson side, if I'm out there selling this thing and then it goes down often, like, yeah, I'm going to feel pretty bad. But really what you're looking for there is the customer happy with it? So if you have that 60% availability, does the customer notice you're down 40% of the time? Do they care? And from the sales side, if they're expecting 100%, if they expect that every time they go to it, then that it should work, then that's a conversation with sales. All of this is a conversation around expectations of what the business wants to do and what the business is going to get out of it. So if maybe on a granular level, if the salesperson goes to the site and tries to do a demo, or they want to train themselves on the software and they're going to it and it isn't working, but no customers are going to it, and therefore the customers don't care, then you have a different problem of the salesperson expects one thing for themselves. They have their own internal availability metric, but the customers have a different one. So you can solve that by maybe spin up some local instance of it or something like that. But it all comes down to a conversation with sales and with the rest of the business of, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is why we're only meeting this level of availability, because going any further doesn't get us more money. It actually makes us less.
I would take out, Mike, you might consider in that phrase is very interesting. I heard the word only as an interesting spin on that. It almost made me feel
yeah,
bad.
You're right.
If you were to say, this is why we are targeting this level of availability, that is our target. It's not that we're failing a commitment. Is that we're targeting a 50% availability during these for whatever reason, right? Because we have decided that's an appropriate amount of money to spend on this problem or hardware or whatever it is, right? Hitting your targets, now you can measure how close to 50%. Great when you exceed it, but you could actually measure, you could say, well, how close are you to that 50% target of what your plan was? Anyway,
my own engineering bias came out there.
I noticed that because 60% is terrible. We should all be ashamed of ourselves and wring our necks.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. We've got literally 1 minute left. I'm just going to call out Jordan. I know you were quiet during it. Any questions? Any thoughts? We're all listening. You may not even be there. You might be off going someplace else. All right. Well, it was a nice try. Mike, I just want to say thank you. This was great.
Thank you, folks. This has been fun.
Notes here. Really appreciate it. We will make the recording available. Mike, I'll send you a copy, and
wonderful.
Available in the Slack room.
Yeah, I'll be in Slack if anyone has any more questions. Feel free to ping me.
Mike's hanging out in there with us. So yeah, Paul says, great. Glad to hear it, Paul. Okay. Thank you,
Wonderful.
Mike. Thanks, everybody.
Right.
Have a
Thanks,
great
Mike.
holiday if you're in the U.S. and a great weekend if not.
Have a
See
good
you,
Thanksgiving
folks.
if you're in the US.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.